Did you know that, at that table, no one truly understood what was about to happen? As they broke the bread and drank the wine, some thought it was just another Passover. Others avoided looking Jesus in the eye, and one of them had already decided to betray him that very night. The Last Supper was not peaceful. It was filled with tension, averted gazes, and a silent love that insisted on staying. Tonight you're going to hear everything that truly happened on that night, not as a simple Bible reading, but as a deep encounter with the most intimate and weighty moment the disciples ever lived beside Christ. So take a moment to subscribe and tell me in the comments where and when you're listening from. It's always special to know who's on the other side, seeking peace before sleep. Now, turn off the lights, take a deep breath, and get ready to step into a small room, lit by oil lamps, where time seemed to stop, and the world was about to change forever. Night was falling. In ancient Jerusalem, the sounds of the day were slowly fading, the clinking of tools being put away, the creaking of wooden doors closing, the distant echo of voices saying goodbye in the stone alleys. Everything seemed to enter a state of pause, as if the city itself breathed more slowly when the sun disappeared behind the hills. It was a Passover night, and for the Jews this was no ordinary evening. It was a living remembrance of deliverance, of blood on doorposts, of haste to leave Egypt. In every home families gathered. The smell of roasted lamb began to spread through the streets. There was the bitterness of herbs, the sweetness of wine, the warmth of washed hands before the bread was broken. But there was something different about that night, something that common people might not sense, but that hung in the air, like a whisper not even the wind dared to carry. At the top of the city, among hills and narrow alleys, there was a reserved room, a simple room, but carefully arranged. Clay dishes, folded towels, jars of dark wine, unleavened bread, everything was ready. But the table, although set, was still empty. Outside, the skies were darkening quickly. Shadows crept into the stone corridors and settled into the corners of the houses. Lamps were being lit one by one, casting a gentle glow on the whitewashed walls. The synagogue gates were already closed, and the hurried steps of the last passers-by echoed through the streets as if they were fleeing from time itself. And with the arrival of night came footsteps, steady, yet quiet. 12 men walked together, an ordinary group to the eyes of others, but their clothes carried the dust of many roads, and their eyes the weariness of those who have seen more than they would like. In their midst walked a silent man, a man many called Master. He walked like someone who knew his destiny, and yet did not turn away from it. Jesus. That night, he didn't speak much. He observed, listened to the sounds around him, noticed how the disciples looked at one another. Each seemed to carry something inside: doubt, fear, pride, homesickness, and a strange sense that everything was about to change. The sandals tapped softly against the dust of the stone path. Peter's eyes, always watchful, now seemed hesitant. John, the youngest, tried to stay close to Jesus, but felt something separating him, like an invisible veil. Judas walked with his head down, carrying in silence a secret too heavy for his heart. As they entered the city, they passed families preparing for the meal. Children helped set the table. The elders told the same stories as always about Moses, about the Red Sea, about the Lamb. But Jesus' eyes were elsewhere. He saw what no one else saw. He saw the shadows drawing near. He saw the plans being laid by religious leaders, disguised as zeal but full of rage. He saw the silver coins already counted by traitorous hands. He saw the cross, still just a pile of wood, soon to take shape. But he didn't quicken his pace. He knew that before the pain, there would be communion. Before the cross, bread would be broken. Before the abandonment, there would be songs. They arrived at the house prepared for them. A simple structure, 2 stories, where the warmth of the stones still held the day's final breath. They climbed the stairs in silence. Each one felt something strange in their chest, as if that dinner marked the end of an era, or the beginning of a goodbye no one was ready to make. Upon entering the room, they were welcomed by the familiar aroma of supper, but the atmosphere was different. The air felt heavier. It wasn't just fatigue, it was something spiritual, invisible, yet present, as if heaven itself was watching that room closely. The windows were slightly open, and the night breeze made the lamp flames dance softly. The shadows of the flames cast the shape of the table onto the wall, a distorted image, like a premonition of what was to come. Jesus entered last. He looked at the table, then at the faces. Some looked away, others smiled awkwardly. Peter adjusted his tunic. John moved closer to the Master. Judas kept an unreadable expression. Jesus knew what each one carried, and even so they were all there, with their fears, their mistakes, their hidden intentions, and their faltering faith. Outside, the sky was already black. Only a few stars timidly peeked through the clouds, and from the city's heights, the distant sounds of other meals beginning could be heard. But in that room, time seemed suspended. The table had not yet been touched. The words had not yet been spoken. The bread was still whole, but Jesus' heart was already broken. He looked around and felt the weight of it all. He knew this would be his last dinner with those men. He knew there would be no other Passover with them, that laughter would soon be replaced by tears, that promises of loyalty would soon be swallowed by cowardice. And even so, he stayed. He sat down, and for the last time, invited his friends to sit with him. Night had finally fallen over Jerusalem, but there in the upper room the light shining over the table didn't come from the lamps. It came from a love that knew what awaited it, and still chose to stay. The setting for the supper was ready. It was a simple room on the upper floor of a modest house, like so many others in Jerusalem. But there was something in that room that transcended the simplicity of the objects. The walls were made of light stone, which softly reflected the yellowish light of the oil lamps. On the floor, coarse rugs, worn by time, covered parts of the cold stone. The scent of wine, bread, and spices lingered in the air like a promise of communion. The table, made of rough wood, was low, as was customary. Around it, cushions and blankets for the guests to recline on, instead of sitting as we do today. There were clay jars filled with water, bowls of bitter herbs, plates with flat, unleavened bread. Everything followed the Jewish Passover tradition, recalling the haste of the Exodus, God's faithfulness, and the blood of the Lamb on the doorposts. But that night, each symbol carried a different weight. The water to be used for foot washing wasn't just for cleansing. It would also represent a gesture that would break the pride of everyone in the room. The bread, which recalled sustenance during the flight from Egypt, would be broken that night with a new meaning. And the wine, oh the wine, would be poured out like never before. Who prepared that room? Perhaps someone close to Jesus, a disciple, an anonymous follower. Perhaps someone who didn't fully understand what was happening but knew they needed to obey. Tradition says that 2 disciples were sent ahead, following Jesus' instructions. Follow the man carrying a jar of water, and they followed him to that house. The owner, without questioning, gave them the space. Maybe he sensed, deep in his soul, that something unique was going to happen there, and it did. While the room waited, there was silence. A full silence. Heavy. As if the stones on the floor already knew what was coming. As if the wooden table itself were in prayer. The oil lamps burned slowly. The light flickered. The shadows danced on the walls as if they sensed the moment drawing near. Every object seemed to be in the right place. There was no luxury. No gold, no silks, no fine perfumes. But there was purpose. Everything there served a final meal. A farewell. A beginning of the end. And even with no one there yet, the setting already said everything. The folded towel. The full jar. The whole bread. The wine resting in the pitcher. The room waited for the men who would change history, not by force but by faith. Not with swords, but with surrender. It was a room like any other, but that night, it would become eternal. Outside, the wind stirred the branches of nearby olive trees. The night brought with it the freshness of spring, but also an invisible weight, as if even the heavens were holding their breath, watching what was about to unfold. There were 12 places around the table. 12 spaces reserved for ordinary men, full of flaws, doubts, and contradictions. Men who had seen miracles with their own eyes, and yet still carried silent fears. Each cushion around the table was more than a physical place. It was a testimony of a calling, of a journey that began on the banks of the Jordan, in the streets of Galilee, on the hills and valleys where they followed the Master. The cloth on the table was clean, but simple. The dishes were made of clay, not silver. The wine was dark, full-bodied, made to leave its mark on the palate. There were herbs laid out in small bowls, mint, parsley, lettuce, to remember the bitter taste of slavery. The lamb was already roasted, waiting. Every detail had been carefully prepared, but also with haste, just as the Passover tradition requires. And even so, nothing in that room felt ordinary. It wasn't just another celebration, it was the end of an era and the beginning of something eternal. Perhaps if someone walked into that room at that moment, they wouldn't see anything remarkable, just a stone room with a modest meal. But if they looked with eyes of faith, they would realize that this was the room where the invisible would touch the visible, where the divine would kneel to wash dusty feet, where the eternal God would break bread with human hands. While the men still walked the streets of Jerusalem toward that place, the setting was already complete. Nothing was missing. The cup was already waiting for hands to lift it. The bread awaited the fingers that would break it. The towel lay still, unaware that it would soon touch the feet of the Creator. In that moment, the room was no longer just a space, it was an altar. It was there that love would be poured out in the form of wine. It was there that pain would begin its slow journey toward Gethsemane. It was there that without fanfare, heaven would sit at the table with sinners. And for a brief moment, everything was in perfect stillness. A strange kind of peace, the kind that comes before the rupture, the kind that arrives seconds before the storm, the peace of the not yet. The pause between the whole bread and the broken bread. The setting for the supper was ready, but what would unfold there, the world would never forget. The stone staircase creaked under the weight of footsteps. One by one, the disciples began to climb. None of them knew exactly how that night would end, but each carried in their chest a feeling they couldn't explain, something between reverence and restlessness. The city below was beginning to quiet down, but inside them, their thoughts seemed louder and louder. Peter was one of the first to enter. His eyes scanned the room attentively. He was the kind of man who needed to understand the environment before feeling comfortable. A warrior, impulsive, intense, but also vulnerable. He looked at the prepared table, the bread, the wine, the cushions around it, and something in his chest tightened. Maybe it was the silence, or the way Jesus had looked at them before coming up. Peter knew that look, and this time, there was something different. John entered shortly after. Still young with a sensitive heart and eyes always on the Master, he always tried to stay close to Jesus, not out of a need for attention, but because of a deep, almost instinctive bond. He sat beside where the Master would probably be. His soul seemed restless, though disguised by the calmness of his gestures. He watched the details carefully, the movements of the other disciples, the flickering light of the lamps, the white cloth laid simply over the wood. James, Bartholomew, Thomas, each entered in silence, each with their thoughts, their doubts. Their sandals struck the stone floor, muffled by the weight of the night. No one spoke, not because there were no words, but because they all knew that any sentence spoken would be too small in the face of what they were about to experience. Matthew, the former tax collector, looked at the objects on the table as if trying to absorb every symbol. Simon the Zealot remained serious, almost tense. Philip stared at the ground, distracted by his own thoughts. They didn't know that those common expressions, those small gestures, would be eternalized. Andrew entered slowly, with almost hesitant steps. His eyes searched for the Master, But Jesus hadn't come in yet. He sat next to James, in silence. None of them were sure what to say. Maybe it was better to say nothing. There was something in the air that called for stillness. And then, Judas. He came in last, the last to arrive. The only one who already knew the end of the story. His steps were restrained. His eyes lowered. He avoided making eye contact with the others. His hands were restless, touching the edge of his tunic, then the empty cup in front of him, then returning to his lap, like someone trying to find a point of balance within their own conflict. He knew that Jesus knew. And even so, there he was. None of the disciples accused him. None of them judged him. But it was as if all of them somehow sensed that something was out of place in that presence. A silent noise in the harmony of their gazes. The room, already heavy, now felt even denser. The presence of the 12 filled the space with a mixture of humanity and destiny. Each of them, with their stories, fears, virtues, and flaws, was about to sit at the table with the Son of the living God. They didn't know, but this would be the last time, the last bread, the last wine, the last song, the last night, with him. Before the cross, the silence among them wasn't empty. It was full of questions, memories, expectations, full of a love that didn't know how to express itself, full of the tension of those who feel something is about to happen, but don't know when, or how, or what to do to stop it. Some thought of the miracles they had witnessed, the multiplication of the bread, the storm calmed with a word, the blind man who could see again, the dead man who rose. It all seemed distant now, as if it belonged to another era, another time. The present was different, heavier, darker, quieter. Others remembered the words Jesus had said days before, "The Son of Man will be delivered." They had heard, but perhaps they hadn't understood. Perhaps they didn't want to understand. The oil lamps cast flickering shadows on the walls. The disciples' shadows stretched, moved slowly, as if dancing with time. It was as if even the light hesitated that night. The men were seated, but they didn't rest. Their bodies were there, but their hearts were restless. It was as if each man's spirit knew that this night would mark them forever, even without knowing exactly why. And Jesus had not entered yet. The absence of the Master seemed to amplify everything, as if he were the balancing point of the room. And without him, everything became more unstable, more fragile, more human. It was in that heavy silence that they waited, some staring at the table, others closing their eyes, others just breathing deeply. And then the sound of footsteps on the stairs, light, slow, steady. They all turned, not with surprise, but with expectation. Jesus appeared at the top of the stairs, his face serene, his gaze deep, his shoulders slightly hunched, not from physical fatigue, but as one who carries the weight of the world on his back. He entered calmly. He said nothing at first. He just looked at those who were there, his friends, his brothers, his betrayers, his children, and even knowing everything, he loved them. They didn't know, but this would be the last time they would all be together, and that moment was about to begin. Jesus entered in silence. The sound of his footsteps was almost imperceptible, but something in the room changed the moment he appeared. The air seemed to grow denser. The lamplight flickered, as if the flames themselves recognized his presence. The disciples shifted, unsettled, but no one spoke. It was as if words were unnecessary or dangerous in that moment. He paused for a moment. There was no hurry. His eyes moved before his feet, and then one by one, Jesus looked at them. First Peter, the impulsive one, the courageous, the loyal, but also the proud and hasty. Peter held the cup in front of him, as if that would make him appear stronger. But Jesus saw beyond. He saw the fear already beginning to form in his chest. He saw the vow Peter would make that night, and the shame that would come with the denial. Jesus' gaze was not one of rebuke. It was a deep gaze, mixing love, warning, and acceptance, as if to say, "You will fall, Peter. But when you rise, strengthen the others." Peter held his gaze for a few seconds, and then looked away. His pride didn't know what to do with so much love. Then John, the youngest, the one with the most sensitive heart, the one who loved with purity, and came close to the Master like a son who trusts. Jesus looked at him with tenderness. He knew John would be the only one to stay near, until the end. He knew he would hear the heart of the cross, and later write about the Word made flesh. It was a calm gaze, filled with promise. You will see me bleed, but you will also see me rise. James, his brother, was beside him. He held a firm posture, but his eyes revealed doubt. He was intense, like Peter, but more reserved. Jesus looked at him like someone who recognizes the silent effort of one who tries to be strong on the inside. I know you don't understand yet, but you will. Bartholomew remained silent. As always, his gaze was observant, respectful. Jesus knew him well, knew that he had learned to believe with his eyes open. You will see greater things than these. He had already said. Now with his eyes, he affirmed again, and you will see more. Matthew tried to hide his restlessness. Even after so much time with Jesus, he still carried remnants of past shame. Jesus noticed, and looked at him with the peace of one who sees the present, not the past. You were called, you were cleansed. You are mine. Thomas was uneasy. His fingers drummed lightly on the table, as if his mind was racing. Jesus looked at him firmly, but without impatience. He knew Thomas would doubt, that he would ask for proof, that he wouldn't believe the first news of the resurrection. But he also knew Thomas would later believe deeply. You don't see now, but soon you will touch my wounds. And there you will find faith. Philip met Jesus' gaze for a brief moment, and lowered his eyes. He was simple, practical, direct. But Jesus looked at him with the depth of one who knows that even practical hearts have space for mystery. You still asks, show us the Father. He who has seen me has seen the Father. Simon the Zealot kept his fists clenched on his knees. He was someone who once dreamed of revolution, of swords, of political freedom. Jesus looked at him with compassion and challenge. You still want to fight, but with the wrong weapons. Let me show you another way. Andrew, always discreet, almost hidden at the edges of the scene, received a long gaze. Jesus knew he was the kind who never sought attention, but who was a bridge between people and God. You have brought many to me, and you will bring more. James, son of Alphaeus, and Thaddeus were also there, almost forgotten in the mentions, but not to the eyes of the Master. Jesus looked at them with the same attention, because there no one was invisible, no calling was small, no heart was less important. I see you. I know you, and you are part of all this. And then, Judas. The final gaze. Jesus took his time. There was no rush. His gaze was steady, long, silent, and full of pain. Judas kept his eyes down, but he felt it. He felt as if that gaze pierced through his body, his mind, his intentions, and reached the most hidden part of his soul. He felt the confrontation, but he also felt the love. A love that was still there. A love that hadn't given up. A love that knew, but did not condemn. You can still stop. You can still return. But Judas would not return, and Jesus knew that. Even so, he looked like one who loves to the end, like one who offers the final appeal, like one who extends his hand, even knowing it will be ignored. And then, without a word, Jesus moved to the table. His eyes had said all that needed to be said. Now, it was time to act. He sat. The disciples followed him with their eyes, some still confused, others moved, but all deeply shaken. None of them left that moment of silence and presence unchanged. Jesus had looked at each one, and in that gaze, he had already given everything. The silence inside the room was almost absolute, but it was not a light silence. It was the kind of silence that weighs, that pulses like a restrained heartbeat, that whispers without making a sound. It was a thick silence, the kind that precedes great events, like the sky that darkens seconds before a storm. Like the moment the judge holds the gavel but has not yet struck it. Jesus had sat down, and the disciples followed him. Slowly each one took his place, but with slow, measured movements, as if they didn't want to make noise, as if they feared that any movement might break something sacred. The tunics brushed lightly against the stone floor. The pitchers were full. The bread remained whole. But inside, no one was at peace. It was a solemn quiet, and strange. Not the kind of tranquility that comforts, the kind that confronts. John, with attentive eyes, watched the Master in silence. He felt that something was changing. Jesus seemed quieter than usual. His movements were slower. His gaze, deeper. Peter avoided looking at the others. He looked at his hands, then at the bread, then at the door. His thoughts were like choppy waves. He remembered Jesus' words, "You will all fall away tonight." And he didn't want to believe it. He fall away, never. But then why that tightness in his chest? Thomas crossed his fingers over his leg. It wasn't just doubt. It was fear. Something in Jesus' expression left him uneasy, as if the Master knew what no one else did, as if every one of his gestures was saying goodbye to the world. In silence, Bartholomew remained still. He just breathed deeply, as if trying to absorb every detail, every second. He knew that night wouldn't be like the others, and he was right. The oil lamps flickered, the oil crackled, the light cast long shadows on the walls, and each shadow seemed to tell a story. The profiles projected on the stone trembled slightly, as if even the light was afraid of what was to come. Jesus had not said anything yet. He just observed. He gently touched the objects on the table, as if blessing them with his touch. His eyes moved from one face to another, and each look carried weight, but also a disarming tenderness. It was as if he could see the past, present, and future of each one there, all at once. The disciples waited. They didn't know for what, but they waited. Then Jesus stood up, slowly, without haste, and with that, the tension increased. All eyes turned to him. But no one spoke. Bodies stiffened. Breaths caught. It was as if the entire universe bent down to hear what would come next. But he didn't speak. He simply walked. His steps took him to a corner of the room, where a folded towel lay. Jesus picked it up carefully. Then, he knelt down and filled a basin with water. The sound of the water being poured broke the silence gently, but made the disciples' hearts race. Peter widened his eyes. He looked at John, who was also confused. Thomas leaned forward, trying to understand what Jesus was doing. Judas simply watched, silent, stiff, as if he no longer belonged at that table. Jesus tied the towel around his waist, picked up the basin, and then walked toward Peter. It was enough for the silence to become even heavier. Peter pulled back slightly, unsure of what to say. His throat was dry, and when Jesus knelt at his feet, Peter almost stood up. "Lord, are you going to wash my feet?" he said, finally breaking the silence, his voice somewhere between surprise and discomfort. Jesus didn't raise his eyes immediately. Calmly, he placed the basin on the ground and replied, "You do not understand now what I am doing, but you will understand later." Peter shook his head. It was too much. This was the Master, the Son of God, kneeling before him like a servant. "Never. You shall never wash my feet." Jesus raised his eyes, steady, deep, with a love that comforts and confronts at the same time. "Unless I wash you, you have no part with me." Peter hesitated. He felt the words pierce his heart like a sword. "Then, Lord, not just my feet, but my hands and my head as well." Jesus smiled sweetly. It was Peter's answer, intense, emotional, full of exaggeration, but also of love. And Jesus knew him. Those who have had a bath need only to wash their feet. Their whole body is clean. The silence returned, but now it was different. It was a silence of surrender, of yielding, of acceptance. One by one Jesus washed the disciples' feet, in silence, kneeling, with gentle movements, like a servant, like a slave. But there was the King, the Creator washing the feet of his creatures. He washed John's feet with tenderness, James with firmness, Matthew's with patience, Thomas with compassion, Simon's with serenity, and then, Judas' feet. Jesus held them with the same hands, with the same gentleness, with the same love. He did not hesitate. He did not tremble. He did not accuse. He washed the feet of the one who, hours later, would betray him with a kiss. The tension in the room reached its peak, but no one could interrupt, because somehow they knew they were witnessing something sacred. Jesus finished, dried his hands, and only then sat down again. The atmosphere had changed. Eyes were wet, hearts stirred. The silence now was one of humility, of reverence, of transformation. They didn't know it yet, but that gesture would be remembered forever, because before the cross came the towel, before the crown of thorns, the basin, before the blood, the water. Jesus didn't just speak of love, he showed it, kneeling. After the heavy silence and the disconcerting act of washing their feet, the disciples were still trying to comprehend what they had just experienced. The basin, now cloudy with the dust of many roads, rested in a corner of the room. The towel, damp and carefully folded, seemed to carry the invisible weight of that moment. No one dared move. The words were still stuck in everyone's throat. Jesus remained silent for a few moments, seated, observing, reflecting, and then he stood up again. But this time, there was no jar, no water, no towel. It wasn't a gesture of practical service. It was something deeper, a new act, a gesture that carried the same spirit as the washing of feet, but now with another layer, the living teaching. The disciples, still with lowered eyes, slowly turned their attention to the Master. There was something solemn in his posture. He wasn't tense, nor dramatic. But the way he stood, the way he looked each one in the eyes, clearly said, "Pay attention." He walked slowly around the table, not in a hurry, but with purpose. His gaze wasn't one of rebuke, but of a teacher who loves too much to let his students walk away without understanding. It was as if each step said, "There is something you must carry with you after tonight. Something you cannot forget." And then, standing before them, Jesus spoke, "Do you understand what I have just done for you?" Silence. No response, because the question was weighty. It wasn't a test question. It was a question that bypassed the intellect and went straight to the heart. It was as if he were saying, "Do you understand the kind of kingdom I'm establishing?" Jesus took a deep breath and continued, "You call me teacher and Lord, and you are right, for that is what I am. But if I, your Lord and teacher, have washed your feet, you also ought to wash one another's feet." It was as if the walls had absorbed those words. The act of washing feet had already shocked them. But now, with words, Jesus left no room for misunderstanding. The act was not an exception. It was a new standard, not an isolated kindness. It was the model of the kingdom. And then, he said something even deeper. "I have set you an example, that you should do as I have done for you." The disciples looked at one another, in silence. Perplexed, Peter stared at the floor. He felt the weight of those words. He who always sought to stand out, now understood that greatness was not about leadership, but about knees on the ground. John's eyes were misty. This was not just about humility. It was about love. About a love that kneels, that serves, that becomes small to save. Matthew, once hated as a tax collector, felt a quiet hope rise within him, because now, he didn't need to prove anything. It was enough to love. It was enough to serve. Jesus continued, "Very truly I tell you, no servant is greater than his master, nor is a messenger greater than the one who sent him. Now that you know these things, you will be blessed if you do them." The words lingered in the air. They echoed within the soul of each one of them. It was as if each phrase opened a new door in their hearts, as if Jesus were drawing, with gestures and words, the picture of a new world, where the strongest kneels, the holiest draws near, and the most worthy becomes the most humble. And there he was, the very Son of God, standing before fragile, confused, sinful men, teaching them the way of the kingdom, with his body, with his gaze, with his actions. But there was more. Jesus took a few steps, and his expression changed. It became more serious, heavier. He knew what was coming after that night. And so he added, I am not referring to all of you. I know those I have chosen. But this is to fulfill the scripture. He who shares my bread has lifted up his heel against me. Their hearts tightened. It was a clear reference, painful, a warning. Jesus was speaking of betrayal, and even as he taught about love and service, he did not hide that he would be betrayed by one of his own. I am telling you now before it happens, so that when it does happen, you will believe that I am he. Silence. A silence different from before. Now it was not just reverence, it was unease, fear, expectation. Jesus knew he was going to the cross, and even so he didn't raise his voice. He didn't impose himself. He simply taught, served, loved, even knowing he would be denied, even knowing he would be abandoned, even knowing he would be betrayed. And finally, with his eyes fixed on them, he declared, Very truly I tell you, whoever receives the one I send receives me, and whoever receives me receives the one who sent me. It was the final teaching before the supper, a standing gesture, a gesture that taught more than any sermon. Jesus had stood to turn the world upside down. He demanded nothing, asked for no recognition, didn't complain about the pain to come. He simply showed how to love, showed how to serve. And then, he sat down again, knowing that even after all of this, many would still struggle to understand. But the gesture had been made, and the lesson had already been given. But while Jesus' gesture still reverberated in the air, like the final note of a silent hymn, a conflict was already growing inside Peter. Peter had always been the most impulsive among the disciples, the first to declare, the first to jump out of a boat, the first to say, You are the Christ, but also the first to panic in the storm, to doubt what he saw, to be overcome by his own strength. And that night, after everything he had witnessed, the Master kneeling to wash his feet, the unexpected gesture, the heavy silence in the air, something inside him was in conflict. A whirlwind he didn't even know how to name. He looked at Jesus like someone looks at a father, but also like someone who cannot understand what that father is about to do. The room was still silent after Judas had left. The door had closed. The sound of footsteps had disappeared down the corridor. But for Peter, that moment would be forever engraved in his memory. The way Jesus looked at Judas, without anger, without threat. Just pain, a pain so deep it seemed to pierce through time itself. Peter gripped the cup tighter. His jaw was clenched. He was sweating. And then Jesus spoke. Now the Son of Man is glorified. It was as if time stood still for a moment. Jesus began to speak of his departure, of how they would no longer be with him, of how they could not follow him just yet. And then, as if he could no longer bear it, Peter asked, Lord, where are you going? Jesus looked at him and replied calmly, Where I am going, you cannot follow now, but you will follow later. Peter furrowed his brow. It sounded like a farewell. It sounded like a farewell, and he hated farewells. Lord, why can't I follow you now? I will lay down my life for you. He said it with firmness, with passion. His heart believed it. Peter spoke with sincerity. He truly thought he could lay down his life for Jesus. But Jesus, with eyes full of love, responded, Will you really lay down your life for me? Very truly I tell you, before the rooster crows you will disown me 3 times. Those words hit Peter like a blow to the chest. It wasn't possible. He'd deny the Master, he who had left everything to follow him, who had recognized him as the Son of God. He tried to argue, but the words got stuck, because deep down, something inside him feared that Jesus was right. And that was his first resistance. Peter resisted the idea of being fragile, resisted the possibility of failing, of being human, of being vulnerable. On the outside he appeared resolute, firm, brave. But on the inside, he was made of the same material as all the others. That night, Peter's resistance wasn't with swords. It was with pride, with the image he had of himself. He believed he was too strong to fall, too loyal to deny, too brave to back down. But Jesus knew him better than he knew himself. And there in front of everyone, the Master announced his weakness, not to shame him, but to prepare him. Because Jesus didn't just want bold followers. He wanted transformed disciples. Peter lowered his eyes. Something inside him broke. It wasn't anger. It was frustration and fear. Fear that Jesus was right. Fear of discovering that, deep down, he wasn't as faithful as he thought. As the supper continued, Peter barely touched the bread. His hands were trembling. The wine tasted bitter. Jesus' words echoed like bells inside his head. Deny 3 times. Before the rooster crows. Could it be? He looked at the others and thought, they might falter. But me. And at the same time, he wondered, what if he's right? What if I really am weak? The struggle inside him was intense. Because there was no external enemy at that moment. There was only the mirror. Jesus looked calmly at Peter, not as one who condemns, but as one who loves to the very end. As one who knows that even after the fall, comes restoration. The supper ended, and the atmosphere had changed. The weight wasn't just of betrayal, but also of what was soon to come. The cross was drawing near, and everyone felt it, even without understanding. Jesus withdrew with the disciples, and Peter followed, silent, alert. Inside, he was no longer the same. Something had broken, but there was still enough pride to resist. He still thought he could prove his worth, still thought he could avoid the prophecy. But what he didn't know was that the true resistance wasn't against Jesus. It was against his own ego. And that battle, Peter didn't yet know how to win. The water Jesus used that night had already been poured out. It seemed ordinary, drawn from a clay jar, poured into a simple basin, used to wash the dusty feet of tired men. But that water, simple in the eyes of the world, was imbued with something sacred. Something that went beyond physical cleansing. Something that revealed the interior of each one of them. It carried the silence of surrender, the weight of love, and the touch of a kneeling king. When Jesus washed Peter's feet, something was revealed. Not just the dust accumulated from the road, but the inner resistance, the hidden pride, the difficulty of accepting that the Master would lower himself to serve. Peter felt the shame rise to his face. He felt his hands clench. He wanted to refuse, wanted to stop it, because deep down, he couldn't handle the vulnerability that act exposed. It wasn't just about dirty feet. It was about proud hearts. It was about the kind of dirt that can't be seen, but that weighs heavy. And each disciple, as their feet were washed, felt it. A discomfort. A mix of gratitude and embarrassment, because Jesus, by touching their feet, seemed to also touch their guilt, fears, and contradictions. The water running down their skin brought out more than Galilean dust. It brought to light the fragile and confused humanity each one carried inside. That water was a mirror. It was a symbol. It was a calling. It said silently, "Let yourselves be cleansed, not just on the outside, but completely." And that hurt, because being cleaned on the outside was easy. But allowing someone to see what was inside, Thomas's insecurity, James's vanity, Judas's hidden ambition, that was another story. The water was still there, resting in the basin, now dirty, and at the same time, purifying. Jesus didn't say anything about it. He didn't explain anything. He simply acted. The gesture was the lesson, the silence, the divine pedagogy. Because some truths cannot be spoken, they must be lived. And as the disciples remembered the touch of his hands, the water running down their feet, the gaze full of mercy as he served them, they began to understand. slowly, in silence, but they understood. John was the first to perceive how much he was being cleansed from within. He felt his heart soften, as if all the defenses he had built throughout his life were being dissolved in that water. He who had always strived to be the closest to Jesus, understood that true closeness wasn't in words, but in allowing oneself to be loved, even without deserving it. James, older, more rational, felt a pang of shame. How many times had he thought himself better than the others? How many times had he boasted of his position among the 12? And now, there he was, seeing himself small before a kneeling master. The water on his feet exposed something much deeper, the need to come down from the pedestal, to recognize that they were all on the same level. The water said it, silently, "You are dust, you need to be cleansed, but above all, you need to allow yourself to be loved." Matthew, the tax collector, so used to being despised, felt something new. It wasn't just acceptance, it was value. Jesus washed him just like he washed the others, no distinction, no reservations. And Matthew, who had so often heard insults, now heard, without words, the silent affirmation of his dignity. "You belong too." Even Judas felt it. He knew what he was going to do. He had already decided. But Jesus' gesture still moved him. The water touching his feet, the firm hands of the Master, and for a moment, a single moment, he hesitated. There was love there was mercy, but unfortunately, he did not allow himself to be transformed by it. That was the difference. The water could wash, but it only transformed those who allowed it to. And that is the mystery of God's love. It does not invade. It invites. It touches, but waits for you to choose. When Jesus finished, he didn't make a scene. He folded the towel, fell silent, sat down again, as if to say, "The lesson has been given, now it's up to you." And indeed it would be. Years later, perhaps on the verge of death, some of those men would remember that moment in detail, not the bread, nor the wine, but the water, because it was there that they began to understand what the kingdom was. It wasn't about power, it was about service. It wasn't about status, it was about heart. And that water, now evaporated from the basin, remained alive within them, because it had touched what no words could reach the soul. The table was set, but no one dared begin the supper. The room still carried the echo of the water, the weight of Jesus' gesture, and the unspoken tension about what was to come. They had all been washed, but they were far from feeling clean inside. It was as if that room, lit by a few flickering flames, was a sanctuary, but also a battlefield, a place where the sacred and the human collided in silence. Jesus looked at the table. His gaze was that of someone who knows, who sees beyond appearances, who already sees the cross while still holding the bread. He stretched out his hands, took the bread, and lifted it slowly. His fingers held it carefully, as if holding something fragile and at the same time, infinitely powerful. The room grew even more silent. The disciples, attentive, knew they were about to witness something that was not just a meal. And then, with a firm gesture, Jesus broke the bread. The dry sound of the bread breaking echoed through the room like a quiet thunder. A snap, a simple sound, but one that said so much. It was the body. It was the symbol. It was the prophecy unfolding before their eyes. Jesus, still holding the pieces, said, "This is my body which is given for you. Do this in remembrance of me." Some disciples swallowed hard, others lowered their eyes. It wasn't just the bread being broken, it was him. It was his love, his surrender, his pain, all condensed in that gesture. Jesus passed the bread among the disciples. One by one they received the pieces with trembling hands. There was no hunger there, no appetite. There was reverence. There was sorrow. There was something invisible being shared along with the bread, the soul of the Messiah. Peter held the piece for a few seconds before bringing it to his mouth. He felt that he was biting into something more than wheat and leaven. It was as if each crumb said, "It is me for you." And that was heavy. John closed his eyes as he chewed. The taste was the same as always, But the moment was different. It was as if he were ingesting the very promise. As if the gesture said, "This is so that you never forget that I gave myself fully." Matthew, the most rational, tried to understand the symbolism. But he realized that there was nothing to understand with the mind. It was the heart that needed to absorb it. Jesus watched in silence. Not with pride, not with fear, but with surrender. It was as if he were saying, "I'm going, but first I want you to know that my pain will be for love." That sharing was a wordless farewell. By breaking the bread, Jesus was not just announcing his death, he was embracing it. He knew what was coming. He knew about the crown of thorns, the nails, the cross, and even so, he continued. Because true love does not retreat in the face of pain. It offers itself. And there he was. The living bread, the eternal sustenance. The Son of God, being broken. The gesture was simple, but what it carried was eternal. Then Jesus took the cup. He lifted it with both hands and said, "This cup is the new covenant in my blood, poured out for you." The word blood made some furrow their brows. Blood was a symbol of sacrifice, of death, of the altar. And now Jesus spoke of his own blood, as a new covenant, a new story, a new chance. The cup was passed from hand to hand. Each disciple drank, in silence, with reverence, as one who knew they were participating in something far greater than they could understand. The taste of the wine was strong, but not stronger than the emotion. Jesus was speaking of the future, but also of the present. He was saying without saying, "I will die. But this is so that you may live." The broken body, the shed blood, the complete surrender. That's what was on the table. And also, inside each one's heart. Jesus didn't explain everything, because some things are not taught with words. They are taught with presence, with sacrifice, with love. The supper continued in silence. Some ate, others just held the bread in their hands, as if it were too sacred to touch. There were tears. There was held breath. There was fear. But above all there was love. Because when someone gives themselves for you, it changes everything. From that night on, the bread would never be just bread again, and the wine would never be just wine, because Jesus had made them eternal symbols of a surrender that would transcend centuries, cultures, languages, and borders. The broken body was the bridge. The shed blood was the door. And every time the bread was broken, he would be there. And every time the cup was passed, he would be remembered, not as a defeated martyr, but as a king who triumphed through love. In Jesus' eyes there was pain, but there was also purpose. He knew this would be the last supper with those men. He knew that many of them still didn't understand what was about to happen. And even so, he loved them deeply. It was a love that did not demand immediate understanding, but planted seeds, seeds that would sprout over time, especially after the resurrection. Bartholomew, silent and observant, kept his eyes fixed on Jesus' hands. He had never been one for many words, but he felt that something grand was unfolding there. His thoughts turned to the prophets, to the temple sacrifices, to the blood of the lambs. And now, the lamb was there, before him, not on a stone altar, but at a wooden table, not as an unconscious animal, but as a man who loved, who chose, who gave. James, son of Alphaeus, fought back tears. He didn't understand how the promised Messiah could speak so openly of death, how the Son of God, with all the power he had shown in healing, casting out demons, calming the sea, could now allow himself to be broken like bread. But deep down James realized, there was more power in that surrender than in any miracle. Jesus, even with a heavy heart, remained calm, not because he didn't feel, but because he was fully aware of the mission. He knew that moment needed to be lived with depth. It was the beginning of the end, and also, the beginning of a new beginning. And while the night continued outside, inside, eternity revealed itself in silence. Years later, when those disciples were scattered throughout the world, facing persecution, prisons, and even death for the sake of the gospel, many of them would remember this night. not as a trauma, but as an anchor. The memory of the broken bread and the shared cup would keep them firm, even on the darkest days, because they knew the body was broken. For love, the blood was shed, for redemption, and that no one could ever erase. The cup had passed from hand to hand. Each disciple had taken a sip of the wine, still trying to digest the words Jesus had spoken moments earlier. This is the cup of the new covenant in my blood. Words that echoed like an ancient mystery but carried a prophetic weight. The wine, red like fresh blood, was no longer just part of a symbolic meal. It was the seal of a radical transformation. It was the beginning of a new covenant. For centuries, the people of Israel had lived under the old covenant, laws, sacrifices, rituals. The blood of animals was shed year after year, attempting to cover the sins of men and women. But now, before the disciples' eyes, Jesus declared something unthinkable. A new kind of blood would be shed. Not the blood of lambs, but his own. The wine represented this. The substitution, the change, the liberation, and more. It was an invitation. By raising that cup, Jesus wasn't only sealing a new covenant, he was offering a new destiny, a new purpose, a new aim for humanity. It was no longer about reaching God through rules, but about being reached by him through love. That wine, in that cup, was the announcement of a path that few could understand at that moment. But one day, it would guide multitudes. It was the new aim, a transformed heart, a reconciled life, a direct communion with the Creator, without veils, without stone temples, without human priests mediating between heaven and earth. The sacrifice would be unique, complete, final. While the cup still passed through hands marked by shared life and lingering doubt, Jesus watched. There was something in his eyes that mixed sorrow and resolve. He knew that many still didn't understand. He knew the new aim would require surrender, courage, faith, and above all, love. The wine on each disciple's lips was like a seed. At that moment, there were no visible fruits, but within each of them, something was being planted. A new understanding, a new covenant, a mission. They didn't know it yet, but they would become ambassadors of that new pact. They would carry in their veins, in their skin, in their words and in their suffering, the taste of that wine. And wherever they went, they would spread this news: the blood has been shed, and nothing will ever be the same. It was the wine of a new aim, a wine that didn't intoxicate the body, but awakened the soul. Peter, as he drank, felt a strange warmth in his chest. It wasn't alcohol, it was awareness. The cup seemed to weigh more than its liquid. It was as if his soul already sensed what was to come: the fall, the denial, the shame, and afterward, the restoration. He drank slowly, with his gaze lowered, and perhaps for the first time in a long while, in complete silence. John received the cup with both hands, as if holding something too sacred to be touched lightly. His eyes were filled with tears. As he brought the wine to his lips, he tasted the sweetness, and then, the bitterness. It was as if God were saying, "This is the taste of surrender," a taste he would never forget. James, always so impulsive, hesitated. He thought of his past ambitions, of when he had sought places of honor beside Jesus. And now, there, with the wine representing blood and sacrifice in his hands, he understood the new aim was not glory. It was surrender. They all drank. They were all marked. And Jesus remained silent. The cup was placed back on the table, now with traces of wine staining the wood, like prophetic marks, like small maps of a journey yet to begin. Jesus looked at the faces around him. Each one represented not just a friend, but a story that would intertwine with the cross. There was still something unspoken. The wine had been presented as a covenant, but what kind of covenant was this? Jesus knew it wasn't a covenant of immediate protection, of easy life, of quick answers. It was a covenant of the cross, of love that bleeds, of faith that asks for no reward. In ancient tradition, covenants were sealed with blood and mutual promises. But in that cup, it was Jesus who promised everything. While knowing he would be abandoned, it was he who gave himself. While knowing he would be betrayed, he offered forgiveness even before the sin, gave love even before the rejection. And therein lay the true revolution of that cup, a new kind of commitment, one not based on human perfection, but on divine perfection. The wine that went down each disciple's throat was the announcement of a new world, not a world without pain, but a world where pain has purpose. Not a world without darkness, but a world where light always wins. The new aim was not comfort. It was transformation. The new covenant demanded that men leave behind the armor of cold religion and embrace the living gospel, that they abandon the stone altars and become living altars, that they trade rituals for relationship, that they leave the crowds and carry the cross in their daily lives. The cup had been passed, and now there was no turning back. In eternity, that moment was already engraved. And every time that gesture would be repeated, with sincerity and reverence, heaven would open again over the earth. And he would be there, present in the breaking of the bread and in the wine of the new aim. Later, the disciples would realize that that wine was also the beginning of a new consciousness. They would never be the same again, nor would the world. The Messiah had sealed a promise with his own blood, and they had drunk from it. A new time had begun, and although they would still stumble, still feel fear, still not understand everything, they were already marked by the wine, by the blood, by the love that chooses to die so that others may live. And there, in the silence of that room, the heavens witnessed the birth of a new covenant, not written in stone, but in the heart of each one who dared to believe. The wine of the new aim had been served, and history would never be the same. While the world outside continued its routine, unaware of what was happening within those four walls, the kingdom of God was being revealed in small details, in a piece of bread, in a sip of wine, in teary eyes, in hearts awakening to something they would only fully understand after the cross. It was the beginning of the greatest love story ever told, and it all began there, with a simple cup, yet filled with eternity. The atmosphere, once silent and filled with reverence, now seemed to have found a kind of fragile balance. The disciples, still under the impact of the broken bread and shared wine, tried to absorb the depth of it all. It was as if each gesture of Jesus had opened a new door in their minds, and they were still hesitating to walk through it. The supper seemed about to end, but Jesus still had something to say, and what he said fell like thunder in that quiet room. "Truly I tell you, one of you will betray me." The words seemed impossible. They didn't just break the silence, they shattered it. Each disciple immediately lifted their eyes, as if they had misheard, as if it couldn't possibly be true, but it was. Jesus didn't speak with anger. He didn't shout, he simply stated, and the calm in his voice only made it all the more unsettling. It was as if he had dropped a bomb in the middle of the table and waited in silence for the dust to settle. The disciples began to look at each other. There was confusion on their faces, fear, suspicion, guilt. Each one, deep down, asked themselves, "Is it me?" Jesus hadn't named anyone. He had simply cast suspicion and let the weight fall on everyone. Peter, always impulsive, leaned discreetly toward John, who was closer to Jesus. With a tense look he whispered, "Ask him who he's talking about." John then leaned closer to Jesus and asked, in a voice barely audible, "Lord, who is it?" Jesus without hesitation replied, "It is the one to whom I will give this piece of bread dipped in the dish." Then he took a piece of bread, dipped it, and gave it to Judas Iscariot. In that instant, time seemed to stop. Judas took the bread, his eyes met Jesus's, and for a moment there was something there that no one else perceived. A deep look full of sorrow, but also of freedom. Jesus wasn't just revealing the traitor, He was in a way releasing him to do what he had already decided in his heart. "What you are about to do, do quickly," Jesus said to Judas. The other disciples didn't understand. Some thought Jesus was telling Judas to buy something for the feast, or to give something to the poor. But Judas knew, and so did Jesus. Judas stood up, walked slowly to the door, and left. And then the sacred text tells us, and it was night. It wasn't just the physical night that enveloped Jerusalem. It was a spiritual night. A shadow had descended over the room. The atmosphere of communion, of teaching, of surrender, was now tainted by the poison of betrayal. Jesus remained seated, serene, as if he had expected this from the beginning. Nothing surprised him. And yet there was sadness on his face, because he loved Judas. He always had. Jesus' heart wasn't indifferent to the pain of rejection. He felt it, but he wasn't controlled by it. The disciples, now in shock, said little. It was as if they were trying to reconfigure their memories, trying to recall something they might have missed. Some gesture, some clue, but there was nothing. Judas had been so discreet, so much a part of the group. How could it be? The phrase Jesus had spoken, "One of you will betray me," didn't just break the mood of the supper, it broke the illusion of control, the illusion that they were all safe, united, in the same spirit. It showed that even among the closest evil can hide. And more than that, it revealed the love of a God who serves even the one who will betray him. Jesus washed Judas's feet, gave bread to Judas, looked Judas in the eyes, and still released him. That wasn't weakness. It was love, love to the end, love that doesn't demand perfection, love that doesn't seek revenge, love that offers, even knowing it will be rejected. After Judas left, the room grew heavy, hearts were tight, but Jesus knew he had to continue, because the plan wasn't finished yet. He had more to say, more to teach. He looked around the table, saw faces marked by fear, but also by faith. He knew many of them would abandon him for a time, but they would return and be transformed. "Now the Son of Man is glorified," he said, as if announcing the dawn in the middle of the night. The disciples looked at each other. Glorified? How could that be? Everything seemed to be falling apart. But Jesus spoke with conviction. For him the cross was not defeat, it was victory in another dimension. And then, as if sealing that moment of revelation and farewell, Jesus looked them in the eyes and declared, "A new command I give you. Love one another. As I have loved you, so you must love one another." It was a counterpoint to the betrayal. It was a call to live the opposite of what Judas had done. If Judas had chosen betrayal, they must choose love. If Judas walked toward the darkness, they must carry the light. In that room lit by flickering flames, a new kind of humanity was being formed. One that understands that love is stronger than pain, that serving is greater than being served, that even when you are betrayed, love remains. The phrase that broke the mood did not destroy the supper, it revealed it. And like all hard truths, it hurt at first, but it would be remembered forever, as the beginning of redemption. In the disciples' memory, that phrase would never be forgotten, because it taught them something no miracle could teach, that even in the midst of betrayal, Jesus stands firm, and love, even wounded, still wins. Later, when telling this story, the disciples would not hide that moment, because they understood that the gospel is not made only of light, but also of shadows that point to the need for light, not only of miracles, but of wounds that show the way to healing. And so on that night, when everything began to fall apart, God was stitching together, with love and pain, the greatest reconciliation in history. It all began with a sentence, and it still echoes within those who dare to face it. "One of you will betray me." And even so, grace continues. The supper had long ceased to be just a dinner. It had become a spiritual battlefield, a stage where every gesture carried eternal weight. The bread had been broken, the wine shared, words had been spoken, some as soft as comfort, others as sharp as a sword. But there was still one final scene to be lived before the night truly began, and it would be silent, direct, and definitive. Jesus, with calm hands, extended the bread dipped in the dish. His eyes were fixed. The atmosphere was heavy. And there in front of everyone, without raising his voice, he handed the piece of bread to Judas Iscariot. It was a simple gesture, but loaded with meaning. There were no accusations, no shouting, no humiliating exposure. Jesus did not point fingers. He did not unmask. He made no fuss. He simply offered a piece of bread. And in that silent gesture, there was more truth than in many speeches. In that culture, sharing bread was a sign of friendship, honor, and deep communion. By giving the bread to Judas, Jesus was not only revealing the traitor, he was offering one last time a chance for redemption. A silent invitation. There's still time, but Judas' heart was already made up. What began with small concessions, subtle greed, and accumulated frustrations, was now a road with no return. He did not reject the bread, he took it. He received the gesture, but not with humility, not with repentance. He took the bread as one takes a key that opens a door too dark to ever be locked again. In that instant, the text says that Satan entered him. Strong words, but they describe something deeply human, the moment we stop resisting evil and start cooperating with it. It wasn't a mystical possession, it was an inward surrender. Judas said yes to his decision, and no to mercy. And Jesus, who knew everything, still offered the bread. The gesture was too radical to be understood in that moment. The other disciples, confused, did not perceive what had just happened. Maybe they thought it was just another symbol, another lesson, but it was more. It was the silent confirmation of a living prophecy. It was the final thread of affection extended to a friend who had chosen to turn his back on love. When Judas received the bread and rose to leave, there was no noise, only the weight of spiritual tension hanging in the air. And then that striking phrase, "And it was night." Yes, it was night outside. But more than that, it was night in Judas's soul. It was night in the heart of the world. The light of the world was still among them, but was about to be extinguished. At least for a while. Judas left, and with him also left the possibility of choice. Now he walked to fulfill what had been written, but also what he himself desired. The gesture of the bread sealed his decision. Jesus did not restrain him, did not coerce him, did not manipulate him. He simply loved him, to the end. The disciples, on the other hand, still did not understand the depth of what had just happened. John, who had heard Jesus say quietly that it would be the one to whom I give the piece of bread, now observed everything in silence. He saw the scene. He saw Jesus's eyes. He saw Judas's face, and something inside him broke. Peter was restless. His protective instinct wanted to act, but he didn't understand against what. There were no swords yet, no soldiers yet, just a room, a table, and the sense that something much greater was underway. Jesus remained seated, his hands on the table. His expression was firm, but full of pain. Because to love to the end also means to bear the pain of rejection. He had just fed the traitor. And more than that, he had just shown that even knowing, he chose to love. This is where many lose their way, trying to understand Christ. Because they expect a king who punishes, a judge who executes. But they find a master who serves, even knowing he will be betrayed. Who offers bread to the one who has already sold him for coins. Who extends his hand to the one who has already handed him over to the enemy. What Jesus did that night was more than a symbol. It was the portrait of the kingdom of God, a kingdom where love is not suspended because of another's failures, where grace is not given based on merit, where even enemies receive bread. This is the scandal of grace, and that was the silent teaching left at that supper. After Judas left, the atmosphere in the room changed. There was still tension, yes, but also clarity. Darkness had manifested itself, but now it was outside. Inside there was still light, and Jesus would use it to teach, until the last moment, the way of love. He looked at the disciples, and then began to speak about what was to come, about glory, about farewell, about a new commandment. But all of that would come after the gesture that had just taken place. because giving the bread to Judas was not a narrative accident. It was the bridge between incarnate love and redemptive suffering. When remembering that scene years later, John did not erase it. On the contrary, he recorded it in detail, because he knew the bread given to the traitor was the greatest sign of a God who loves without reservation, who offers to the end opportunities to turn back, who does not give up, even knowing the end of the story. Judas, unfortunately, chose the path of darkness, but not before being loved. And perhaps that is the deepest truth of that night. God's love reaches even those who choose to flee from it. There in the silent offering of a piece of bread was the summary of the gospel, a gesture, a choice, and a love that gives up on no one. In that simple room in Jerusalem, among clay dishes and lit lamps, heaven touched earth more powerfully than any public miracle. Because there, with the hands that healed the blind and calmed storms, Jesus chose to offer bread to the one who would betray him, and that gesture became eternal, not because of the traitor, but because of the love that never stopped loving. And to this day, every time the bread is broken in his memory, that scene repeats itself in silence. A master offering himself, even to those who still do not understand the value of his gesture. And in that mystery, the kingdom is revealed, with bread, with love, with an invitation that never imposes but always offers, to the end. Judas had left. The door closed behind him. No words, no explanation, no farewell. Only the barely perceptible sound of footsteps fading away, and the silence that remained. It was a strange silence. Dane's spiritual. The kind of silence that doesn't come just from the absence of sound, but from the presence of something no one can explain. The disciples didn't know what to say, or how to react. Everything was confusing. The Last Supper, which had begun with symbols, teachings, and gestures of love, was now marked by the shadow of betrayal. John stared at the table. The piece of bread was still vivid in his memory. Jesus' hand, firm and generous, offering something sacred to someone who had already traded faith for coins. Peter was still trying to understand why he didn't stop it, why he didn't stand up, why he didn't ask more direct questions. The others, in silence, dealt with what they could: doubt, fear, anger, helplessness. And Jesus, he too was silent. But Jesus' silence was different. It wasn't a silence of confusion, nor of insecurity. It was a silence full of awareness. He knew what was coming. He knew what was in the heart of each one there. He knew it wasn't just Judas who would leave him. In a few hours they would all flee, and even so he was there, present, serene, steady. This silence wasn't empty. It was preparation, a weight full of meaning. There was something Jesus wanted to make clear before the crucifixion, something that needed to be absorbed not by the mind but by the Spirit. And sometimes the only language capable of transmitting eternal truths is silence. Judas' absence wasn't just physical, it was symbolic. The room where they were felt lighter, but also more tense. What had been only suspicion was now reality. The betrayal had begun. It was in motion. There was no turning back. It was in this atmosphere that Jesus rose again and looked at the disciples. The tension still hovered in the air, but he knew he had to continue. And not with a harsh speech, nor with reprimand, but with love. It was then that he pronounced the new commandment. A new command I give you. Love one another. As I have loved you, so you must love one another. The betrayal had just happened. But Jesus' response wasn't revenge, nor indignation. It was love. It was as if he were saying, "You saw what happens to those who choose selfishness. Now I want to show you the opposite path." The silence that followed the betrayal became the soil where Jesus planted the seed of unconditional love. The disciples were shocked. Judas wasn't a stranger. He was one of the 12. A friend, a companion on the journey. Someone who had been with them in the most miraculous moments. And yet he chose another path. Jesus knew that soon all of them would be tempted to distance themselves, to distrust each other, to blame, to point fingers, to isolate. That's why he spoke of love, of unity, of a commandment that goes beyond the emotions of the moment. The silence wasn't interrupted by shouting, but by an invitation: stay together. Even when everything seems lost, Peter took deep breaths, still processing it all. He wanted to promise loyalty, but Jesus saw beyond. He knew even Peter would deny him. And even so, he included him in the message. Love one another. The words didn't demand perfection, but they called for faithfulness in love. In Jewish culture, betrayal was a grave sin, especially when it came from someone close. And in light of that, the expected response would be punishment or rupture. But Jesus breaks that pattern. He teaches that even when evil comes through the door, the response must be greater than the pain. That silence then became a sanctuary, a space where the disciples could finally look inward, at their own failures, at their own limits. It was a silence that taught, a silence that said more than 1,000 words. Because often after a wound, there's nothing left to say, only time. A look. The love that remains even when everything seems to fall apart. Jesus used that moment to show that the kingdom he came to establish was not based on control, personal glory, or human victories. It was a kingdom where even silence has a voice, where even pain becomes seed, where betrayal doesn't have the last word. And so the supper continued, but now, with different eyes. Each disciple felt the weight of their own heart, what they had done, what they would still do. And even so, Jesus loved them, remained with them, continued teaching. The silence that followed the betrayal wasn't the end of the night. It was the beginning of transformation, because sometimes it's in the silence after the fall that grace whispers the loudest. And there, in that simple room, among sighs and quiet glances, the disciples began to understand that they were facing something much greater than they could grasp. The light still shone, even though outside, it was already night. In each of their lives, that silence would be remembered forever, because it wasn't a void, it was a space filled with the presence of God. The exact moment when everything began to change from within. There was no way to go on the same. Something had been broken, but something else had been planted. Later, many of those men would repeat the gesture of breaking the bread. They would remember the wine. They would preach in Jesus' name, but they would never forget the moment when the traitor left, and love remained. The silence of that night would echo in the prisons where they would be taken, in the streets where they would be persecuted, in the eyes of those they would try to reach. Because in that silence they understood that Christ's love doesn't depend on the other's behavior, and that true victory isn't in avoiding betrayal, but in continuing to love even after it. And so the night went on. But now, they were ready to listen, with the heart, because the silence that follows betrayal is the soil where true love decides to bloom. The silence still hung in the air. The shadow of betrayal had just passed through the room. But what remained there was not destruction, it was love. Jesus knew that this was the moment to leave something more, not just instructions, not just warnings, but something that spoke directly to the heart. And so he began to speak his final words of love. They were not memorized or rehearsed words. They were words born from the heart of someone who knew he was about to depart, but still had time to love. And when time is short, every sentence becomes precious, every pause, sacred. Jesus looked at each one of them. His eyes weren't looking for traitors but for disciples, not seeking justice but compassion. And then, with a steady and serene voice, he began to speak. "Little children, I will be with you only a little longer." None of the disciples had heard him call them that before. Little children. It was as if in that moment the Master became a father, a shepherd, a protector. It was a tenderness that pierced through the hardness of the night and warmed their already weary hearts. He no longer spoke to grown men but to fragile souls. The tone of Jesus' voice was that of someone saying goodbye on their deathbed. But unlike the despair that marks human farewells, there was peace. There was purpose. There was surrender. He continued, "You will look for me, and just as I told the Jews, so now I tell you, where I am going, you cannot come." The disciples looked at each other. The words weren't new. He had spoken of this before. But that night, they sounded different. They carried a weight they hadn't had before. It was no longer theoretical teaching. It was real. He was really leaving, and for the first time they felt it in their bodies. Jesus knew that, and so he didn't dwell on the pain of separation. Instead, he offered something that could keep them united even in his absence. "A new command I give you: love one another, as I have loved you." It wasn't a suggestion, it was a command. But not just any command. It was new, and it was personal. He didn't say, "as you think you should love," nor "as the Pharisees teach," but "as I have loved you." It was the highest standard possible. He who had washed their feet, who endured their immaturity, who guided them with patience, who offered bread to the traitor. That love was the measure. The disciples listened in silence. Jesus' words settled into their hearts like seeds in freshly turned soil, and he went on, looking each of them in the eyes. "By this everyone will know that you are my disciples, if you love one another." It was as if he were saying, "You want the world to see me in you. It won't be through miracles, nor eloquence, nor strength, but through love." That's what he wanted to be remembered that night. Not the pain of betrayal, not the anguish of the cross, but the love that overflows even in the final words. Peter then couldn't hold back. He interrupted, anxious, "Lord, where are you going?" Jesus with tenderness replied, "Where I am going, you cannot follow now, but you will follow later." But Peter insisted, "Lord, why can't I follow you now? I will lay down my life for you." Jesus looked at him with compassion. He knew Peter believed what he said, but he also knew what was coming. "Will you really lay down your life for me? Very truly I tell you, before the rooster crows you will disown me 3 times. And even after that revelation, Jesus didn't push Peter away. He didn't shame him. He kept loving him, because that's how he loved. And then, as one who prepares his friends' hearts for a foretold grief, Jesus offered comfort, not with pre-made phrases, but with eternal promises. "Do not let your hearts be troubled. You believe in God. Believe also in me. My Father's house has many rooms." It was his way of saying, "I'm going, but not forever. There is a place prepared for you, and I myself will return to take each one." Those words were engraved. They were the last before the darkness, the last before the cross, the last before the abandonment. But at the same time they were the first seeds of the kingdom that would bloom after the resurrection. The disciples were silent again, but now it was a different silence, a hopeful silence, full of questions, yes, but also full of a love that was beginning to make sense. Jesus had just been betrayed. He knew he would be denied. He knew he would be abandoned. And even so, what came out of his mouth was love. There was no resentment, no irony. There was surrender. Each sentence was a hug, each word a bridge. The final words of love from Jesus were not spoken to be admired, but to be lived. And even today, they still echo in hearts brave enough to listen. That night before the garden, before the arrest, before the trial, he left us the most precious thing, a love that doesn't end with rejection, that doesn't depend on reciprocity, that continues to the end. After that moment, the disciples would never be the same. They would still stumble, still be afraid, still run away. But deep in their souls, those words had taken root. When Peter cried after denying the Master, he would remember the look of love. When John witnessed the cross, he would remember the words, "Love one another." When Thomas doubted, he would remember the promise, "My Father's house has many rooms." And when years later, they all faced prisons, beatings and death, what would sustain them was exactly that. The final words of love. What Jesus planted at that supper was not a doctrine. It was a way of life, a path, a way of being. And today, so many centuries later, we are still invited to listen to what he said that night, not just with our ears, but with our hearts, because those final words of love remain the foundation of the kingdom, the essence of the gospel, the purest reflection of who he is. They weren't erased by history, they were sealed with blood, and for that reason they never die. The room was immersed in an atmosphere that mixed love, tension, and reverence. The words of Jesus still echoed in the air, words of farewell, comfort, and commandments of love. The disciples remained silent, as if each were processing in their own way everything that had been said and experienced that night. But there was still something unresolved, something that Jesus, in his compassion, would not let pass in silence. Peter, impulsive as always, had been the only one to stand up amid the tension to declare his unconditional loyalty. It was typical of him. Speaking before thinking, loving intensely, promising with an inflamed heart. And Jesus, who knew the heart of each one there better than anyone, knew that this courage hid a fragility that Peter had not yet faced. Then with tenderness and firmness Jesus looked at him and said, "Simon, Simon, Satan has asked to sift all of you as wheat." The phrase fell like a soft thunder, strong but full of love. Peter didn't understand immediately. What did it mean to be sifted? Why would Satan want him? And why was Jesus saying this now? Jesus continued, "But I have prayed for you, Simon, that your faith may not fail. And when you have turned back, strengthen your brothers." It was both a prophecy and a promise. Jesus didn't say if Peter fell. He said when. It was certain. The fall would come, the stumble, the weakness, the denial, but the return would come too. The restoration, and more. Peter would become an instrument of strength for the others. Peter, however, reacted with disbelief. Like someone who still doesn't see their own limit, he replied emphatically, "Lord, I am ready to go with you to prison and to death." He was sincere, completely sincere, but also deeply naive. Because those who love with puffed-up chests sometimes don't realize how vulnerable their own hearts are. Jesus once again looked at him with sweetness, and with the firmness of someone who sees the future clearly, responded, "Peter, I tell you, before the rooster crows today, you will deny 3 times that you know me." An uncomfortable silence settled, not one of judgment, but of raw reality. Peter was caught off guard. He, the boldest, the most impulsive, the one who always stepped forward, was now being told he would falter, that he would fail, that on a dark night, he would pretend not to know his own master. But Jesus didn't say that to humiliate him. He said it to prepare him. Theaternize, because only those who are warned of their own weakness can humbly choose restoration when it comes. The warning was a form of love, a hand extended even before the fall, and Peter was silent. For the first time that night, he had nothing to say. Jesus' words echoed inside him, battling against his sense of courage. He wanted to be faithful. He was willing to die. But Jesus saw what he did not yet see: the fear, the exhaustion, the instinct of self-preservation, that in the moment of trial would speak louder. There, in that room still lit by oil lamps, Jesus was not only prophesying a betrayal, he was revealing Peter's humanity, and at the same time preparing him for a love that does not give up even in the face of denial. The other disciples heard, but said nothing. Perhaps because they knew that deep down, they too would fail, that in some way they too would run away, and that Jesus with his gaze had already forgiven them even before it happened. That's how he loved, with anticipation, with truth, with grace. Hours later, everything would happen as he had said. Peter would see Jesus being arrested. He would see the sword cut off the servant's ear. He would see the master's calm gaze in the face of soldiers. And then, afraid, heart racing, mind confused, Peter would do what he never thought he would do. He would say, "I do not know him." Once, twice, 3 times, until the rooster crowed. And in that instant Jesus' gaze would meet his, a gaze without judgment, a gaze that said, "I warned you, and I still love you." Peter would weep bitterly. But that pain would not be the end. It would be the beginning of a transformation, because that warning given during the supper was not a sentence. It was a promise of a new beginning. Jesus knew Peter would fall, but he also knew Peter would rise again. And more, he knew that after the pain Peter would become a shepherd, a leader, a man broken and full of compassion. The denial would not be the final point, but the turning point. And it all began there, with words spoken not to condemn, but to set free. The last warnings of Jesus were not about guilt. They were about a love that does not fail, even when we do. Peter would still take time to fully understand that. But that night, marked by words of warning and tenderness, would become unforgettable. Years later, when he wrote his letters to the churches, his words would be loaded with that experience. He would say, "Be sober and watchful. Your adversary the devil prowls around like a roaring lion, looking for someone to devour." He knew what it was to be sifted. He knew what it was to almost fall. But he also knew what it was to be restored. Jesus didn't take away from Peter the weight of failure, but he gave him, even before the fall, the promise of rebuilding. That is love. It's a kind of love that looks at weakness and doesn't give up, that sees the stumble before it happens, and prepares the embrace for the return. That night, Peter didn't understand, but everything Jesus said would echo in his soul until the end of his life. And we, as we look at this scene, learn something profound. True faith is not the one that never fails. It is the one that returns to love, even after failure. And that is what Jesus offered to Peter, and offers to us, even today. Because Peter's story is, deep down, the story of all of us. We want to get it right. We promise loyalty. We get emotional in the presence of God. But in moments of fear or pressure we deny. We forget. We run away. And even so, Jesus keeps saying, "I have prayed for you." That changes everything. Knowing that even before failure, there is intercession. Even before the stumble, there is compassion. Even before repentance, there is a love that does not give up. That night, Peter was warned, and even without fully understanding, he received the seed that would later sprout into strength, faith, and mission. And we, as we hear this part of the supper, can rest in this truth. The love of Christ is greater than our instability. He warns us, sustains us, and restores us, always. The night had already deepened. Outside, Jerusalem slept in relative peace, unaware that this would be the last night of freedom for the man who would change the world. Inside the upper room, after the tension, the teachings, and the words of love, there remained a solemn atmosphere, like the end of a sacred ceremony. There were no more discussions, no more questions, only silence. A silence that, although heavy, was respectful, the kind of silence that precedes a farewell. Jesus knew that his time with the disciples was coming to an end. That supper was not just a meal. It was a rite of passage. It was the preparation for the darkest moment in history, and at the same time for the brightest redemption of humanity. He had done everything perfectly: washed their feet, taught love, warned about betrayal, offered the bread and wine as eternal symbols. But something was still missing: the farewell. And Jesus didn't want to leave without giving them a memory deeper than the pain they were about to feel. With a soft but firm voice, he said, "I will not speak with you much longer, for the prince of this world is coming. He has no hold over me, but he comes so that the world may learn that I love the Father and do exactly what my Father has commanded me." These words said a lot. They were the words of someone at peace with the mission, of someone who knew that death was not defeat, but obedience, that suffering was not the end, but the path to glory. And Jesus, as he said goodbye, didn't ask for pity. He didn't complain. He didn't lament. He simply reaffirmed his love for the Father and for the disciples. Then he called them to leave that place. And as they walked, perhaps descending the stairs of the upper room, perhaps crossing dark alleys toward the Mount of Olives, he began to sing with them. Yes, sing. The Jewish custom said that after Passover, the faithful should sing the hollow psalms. They were songs of praise, gratitude, and trust. Jesus chose to end that night by singing with his friends. A song as farewell. There was no sad music. It was reverence, courage, surrender. Imagine the scene, the moonlight softly illuminating the tired faces of the disciples, the stones of the path echoing the steps of men who didn't yet know what awaited them, and among those steps their voices rising in unison to sing, "Praise the Lord, all you nations, extol him, all you peoples." Each verse sounded deeper as they knew, or at least felt, that something was changing. Jesus sang, even knowing the cross, even knowing the pain, even aware of the coming betrayal and abandonment. He sang because he was at peace, and because he wanted his disciples to know that hope is greater than death. As they walked, Jesus continued to teach them. He said that they were the branches and he the vine, that they should remain in him, for apart from him they could do nothing. He spoke about the Holy Spirit, the Comforter, who would come. He promised he would not leave them as orphans. His words were balm, as if he were leaving small lit beacons for when the darkness surrounded them. "I have told you this so that my joy may be in you, and that your joy may be complete." It was strange to hear about joy on a night like that. But Jesus spoke of a joy that doesn't depend on circumstances. A joy born from the certainty of being on the right path, even if that path leads through the cross. Jesus' farewell was not theatrical. There were no dramatic tears, no emotional pleas. It was sober, serene, deep, and precisely for that reason, unforgettable. He was preparing his friends to live without his physical presence, but never without his real presence. As they approached the Garden of Gethsemane, Jesus stopped. He looked at each of them, as if to fix that moment in eternity. The night was cold, and the world outside was already conspiring against him. But there among the olive branches, among friends who still didn't understand everything, he left what may have been his strongest gesture: peace. Peace I leave with you, my peace I give you. I do not give to you as the world gives. Do not let your hearts be troubled, and do not be afraid. It was the seal of his farewell, the certainty that, although physically taken, he would remain spiritually. It was a goodbye, but with the promise of reunion, a pause, but with the assurance of continuation. The disciples were still confused, but they felt something. Perhaps they couldn't put it into words, but they knew that night was holy. That farewell was divine. Then Jesus looked to the sky, and in a prayer that would forever mark history, he interceded for them. He didn't ask for them to be free from pain, but to be kept in the truth. He didn't ask for glory, but for unity. He didn't ask for honor, but that his love would remain in them. And with that, he said goodbye, not with tears, but with faith, not with despair, but with purpose, not with defeat, but with the certainty that the kingdom of God had begun. And so the Master left the supper, walking toward the cross, but carrying with him the love that would change everything. That night, Jesus taught us how someone who loves says goodbye, with calm, with presence, with hard truths spoken tenderly, with songs sung even on the edge of suffering. That was the farewell of a master, but also the sending out of a father who was raising mature children. Jesus didn't spare them from pain, but equipped them with everything they would need to endure it. And that is the most real kind of love there is. Centuries later, we still hear the echo of that farewell. We still read his words as one reads a letter left by someone who left but promised to return, because that's exactly what it was. Jesus' farewell was not an end, it was a crossing. And as he left that room, he was not being defeated, he was winning. The cross was only the beginning. And we, as we remember that supper, that walk, that prayer, we understand that even in the most painful farewells, God never stops being present. Because the Master may have departed that night, but his love never left us. The supper had come to an end. The words had already been spoken, the eyes exchanged, the gestures made, the basin, the bread, the wine, all of that now became part of the collective memory of those men marked by the night. But there was one last gesture that could not be left out, and that, although simple, carried eternal depth. The singing. The biblical text, discreet and direct, simply says, "And when they had sung a hymn, they went out to the Mount of Olives." A short sentence, almost imperceptible, but it carries immense weight, because that hymn was more than a closing. It was an act of faith, a seal of trust in the midst of the shadow already approaching. It was the Master's last song before the cross. There at the end of that supper, Jesus decided to sing, and that in itself is already a teaching. Singing doesn't seem natural in the midst of tension. When one knows that betrayal is on its way, that the soldiers are gathering, that the trial will be unjust, and the cross inevitable, the most common reaction would be to flee, to be silent, or simply to pray. But Jesus sings, and he doesn't sing alone. He invites the disciples to sing with him, even if they didn't fully understand, even if their voices were choked, even if fear was already beginning to show behind every glance. Singing at that moment was an act of resistance, of courage, of obedience. In Jewish tradition, the most likely hymn sung by Jesus and his disciples was part of the Hallel Psalms. One of those psalms says, "This is the day the Lord has made. Let us rejoice and be glad in it." It is almost unsettling to think that this phrase was sung on the eve of the crucifixion, but that is precisely the point. Jesus didn't see suffering as the end. He saw purpose, and so he sang. To sing is to trust. It is to say with the soul what the mouth may not yet know how to explain. It is to surrender the night to God, with melody. Perhaps the voice of Jesus was firm though gentle. Perhaps Peter sang more softly, still in inner conflict. Perhaps John, the most sensitive, let a few tears escape as he sang the sacred verses. Each sang as he could. But they all knew this wasn't just a tradition, it was a farewell. And more than that, it was a declaration of faith. Jesus, even knowing what he would face in the coming hours, chose to sing, chose to fill the space with sacred words instead of murmurs of fear. He, the living Word, chose to give voice to the Scriptures in the form of a song, and that teaches us something precious. There is a kind of strength that only worship reveals. The song of the disciples, guided by Jesus, rose in that room like a final offering before the battle. It was as if they said to the heavens, "Even without understanding, we trust. Even with fear, we move forward. Even before the cross, we praise." And this is one of the most beautiful marks of faith, to sing even when there is no apparent reason. Because the reason isn't in the circumstance, it's in who God is. After the hymn, the steps began. They went out toward the Mount of Olives. The song still echoed in each heart. Even without instruments, even without perfect pitch, that song was sacred. It was the link between the upper room and Gethsemane, between the table and the altar, between communion and sacrifice. And there was something even deeper. In the tradition of the people of Israel, singing the Hallel Psalms was to remember the deeds of God in the past, how he freed the people from slavery in Egypt. It was to give thanks for God's faithfulness through the generations. And now God himself made man sang those psalms, about to bring deliverance once more, not from Egypt, but from death, not from Pharaoh, but from sin. He sang as one who knew that freedom was near, even if it would come through the cross. To sing the Hallel Psalms that night was for Jesus an act of alignment with the eternal plan. For the disciples, it was a moment of communion. For heaven, it was the beginning of a new story, and perhaps that's why the Gospel says so little about that moment. Because there are silences that only reverence can explain. After that song, Jesus would never again be the same in their eyes. He would be arrested, judged, humiliated, crucified. But that melody would remain in the hearts of the disciples. When everything turned dark, they would remember, "He sang with us," and that would change everything. And today, as we calmly look at that moment, we are also invited to sing even with tears, to sing even without answers, to sing because we know that if Jesus sang before the cross, we too can find strength in worship, even amid our own crosses. To sing is to trust that, even in pain, God is writing something greater. It is to proclaim with the voice what the heart sometimes hesitates to feel. It is to align with heaven, even when the earth feels unstable. Jesus showed us that. At the Last Supper, between gestures and words, he taught us the power of praise, and with a simple hymn, he prepared the hearts of his disciples for what was to come. May we also learn to sing, even when the night is long, even when everything seems lost, because sometimes, faith lives in the song, and in faith lives victory. They sang a hymn, and then walked together, not as those who bid farewell to life, but as those who walk toward eternity. That song sealed what human words could never describe. It was the sound of obedience, the sound of love, the sound of heaven touching earth one last time, before the darkness fell. The room was left behind. The voices ceased. The song, now distant, still seemed to echo between the walls where the most remarkable supper in history had taken place. The steps began slowly, almost hesitantly. Like those who leave a safe place to face the unknown, Jesus walked ahead. The disciples followed him, and the night was colder. It wasn't just the temperature, it was a chill that came from within, as if the world had changed in silence while they were still sitting at the table, as if the walls of Jerusalem carried a premonition, as if the wind knew what was coming. They went out toward the Mount of Olives, as they had done many times, but this time was different. It wasn't just an ordinary walk, it was a passage, a shift from the time of intimacy to the time of pain. The disciples, still digesting everything they had heard and lived during the supper, walked in silence. There were no more questions, no more debates. Each carried something in their heart: fear, confusion, love, guilt. Some walked with their heads down, others looked at Jesus from time to time, as if trying to memorize every movement, every gesture, every step of the Master. Peter was quieter than usual. After being warned that he would deny Jesus 3 times before the rooster crowed, he felt a knot in his chest. Jesus' words wouldn't leave his mind. "I would never do that," he thought. "I would never deny the Master." But deep down inside, he knew something was about to be tested. John, with his sensitive heart and eyes still misty from the intensity of what he had witnessed, remained close to Jesus. He didn't want to lose sight of him. Something inside told him that this night would be unforgettable, and not for good reasons. Walking through the dark streets of Jerusalem at that hour had something symbolic about it. The city, which during the day bustled with people because of Passover, now seemed quieter, darker. There were shadows between the columns of the houses, and the sound of footsteps echoed more than usual. Every corner seemed to hide an expectation, every tree, a memory, every gust of wind, a warning. Jesus walked without haste, but also without hesitation. His eyes were fixed ahead, like someone who had already seen it all before. He knew exactly where he was going: to the garden, to the moment that would mark the final transition between discipleship and sacrifice. He knew what was coming, and still, he went. On the way, perhaps no one knew what to say. They had sung, they had heard deep words, they had eaten and drunk with the Master. They had witnessed a love that kneels, that washes feet, that forgives before betrayal. And now, they walked alongside the one who was about to be handed over. The night grew deeper, and the closer they got to Gethsemane, the heavier the air seemed to become. The sky, dark. The moon, perhaps hidden by clouds. The branches of the olive trees swaying gently, and the hearts tightened. There, along the way, Jesus stopped for a moment. He turned to them. The silence was total. And then, with a calm and firm voice, he said, "You will all fall away because of me this night, for it is written, I will strike the shepherd, and the sheep of the flock will be scattered." The words cut through the air. The disciples looked at each other, tense. None of them wanted to believe it. How could they all fall away? They had sworn loyalty. They had left everything to follow him. But Jesus spoke like someone who already knew every detail of what was to come. And before anyone could say anything, he added, "But after I have risen, I will go ahead of you to Galilee." It was like a ray of light in the midst of darkness. Even there, in the middle of a prophecy of abandonment, Jesus planted hope. He was already speaking of the resurrection, already promising a reunion, because even in the face of his friend's greatest failure, he never stopped believing in their return. As they walked, the images of the supper still turned over in the disciples' minds. Jesus' words echoed as if etched into their souls. "One of you will betray me. You will also abandon me. This is my body. This is the cup of the new covenant." It was as if each phrase now carried even more weight in the growing darkness. Peter, more restless than the others, came close to Jesus and murmured with restrained intensity, "Even if all fall away, I never will." Jesus looked at him with tenderness and sorrow. There was no anger in his face, only the painful certainty that Peter didn't know himself as well as he thought he did. He replied gently, "Truly I tell you, this very night, before the rooster crows, you will deny me 3 times." Peter stopped. He felt as if a sword had pierced him. He wanted to protest, to swear once again his loyalty, but he remained silent. Something inside him said the Master was right, that some part of him, hidden, had not yet been tested, and that this part might fail. The other disciples listened, but had no words. The path to Gethsemane became a road of introspection, with each step a thought, with each turn a memory, with each breath a silent prayer they themselves might not fully understand. The night was colder, the trees grew denser as they neared the garden. The smell of damp earth, of olive trees and night, brought with it a sanctuary-like atmosphere. There were no crowds, no noise. It was as if the entire universe was in a state of waiting. Upon arriving at the place, Jesus stopped. "Sit here while I go over there and pray." His voice was firm, but in it was a new gravity, as if he were already carrying the weight of the whole world before the cross. Leaving most of the disciples there, Jesus took Peter, James and John with him. They were his closest friends, those who had been with him in moments of glory, like the Transfiguration. Now, they would be with him in the shadow. As they moved away, Jesus' eyes began to reveal what the disciples had never seen before: anguish. He began to be deeply distressed, and then he said, "My soul is overwhelmed with sorrow to the point of death. Stay here, and keep watch with me." It was the first time Jesus verbalized the weight he carried inside, the sadness of knowing what was to come, the pain not just physical, but spiritual, the abandonment, the betrayal, the silence of heaven, the burden of the sin of all humanity. He felt all of it, and still, he pressed on. At the foot of a rock, Jesus knelt down, and while the disciples struggled against sleep, the Savior of the world poured out his soul before the Father. The night was colder, and the sky more silent. The Garden of Gethsemane had always been a place of prayer, a silent refuge among the olive trees, away from the noise of Jerusalem. But that night, it would become the setting for something deeper, more intense. The place where the Son of God would pour himself out in pain before the Father. It was the beginning of the agony. Jesus was alone. Although Peter, James, and John were just a few meters away, they couldn't feel the weight that fell upon him. They couldn't see the storm within his soul, because the battle being fought there was invisible to human eyes. It was a silent but devastating war. The battle between the desire to escape and the mission to surrender. He knelt on the cold ground, among stones and twisted roots. His hands touched the earth as if seeking support. His face bowed, his eyes closed. And then, he prayed, "Father, if it is possible, take this cup from me, yet not my will, but yours be done." It was a whisper, a cry full of humanity. In that phrase there was vulnerability, pain, and at the same time submission. Jesus didn't hide his fear. He didn't mask his anguish. He exposed everything before the Father. Because there, more than at any other moment, he was showing what it means to be human, and what it means to trust completely. Sweat began to run down his face. It wasn't just physical exertion. It was the sign of a soul in conflict. The Gospels say his sweat turned into drops of blood, so great was the tension. Science calls it hematidrosis, a rare condition caused by extreme stress. But the Bible calls it love. Love that fights until it bleeds. Love that kneels and cries out, even knowing it will not be spared. Meanwhile, the disciples slept. Even after the request, "Watch with me," they succumbed to fatigue. Maybe they didn't understand the gravity of the moment. Maybe sorrow had drained their strength. But in that crucial moment, Jesus was alone. He returned to them, found them asleep, and with a trembling voice, he said to Peter, "Could you not watch with me for 1 hour? Watch and pray so that you do not enter into temptation. The spirit is willing, but the flesh is weak." There was sadness in those words, not of reproach but of sorrow. Because even loving those men deeply, Jesus knew that loneliness was part of the path. The abandonment began there. Not with hatred but with human frailty. He withdrew again, and prayed a second time. "Father, if this cup cannot pass unless I drink it, may your will be done." It was as if his soul were being crushed, just like the olives there in the garden. Gethsemane, in Hebrew, means oil press, and now, the Anointed One of God was being pressed in spirit, soul, and body. The minutes dragged on. The sky remained silent. No audible response, no visible sign, only darkness, only the sound of the wind among the leaves, only the cry of a man alone, carrying the weight of the world. For the third time Jesus prayed. The words no longer came with the same strength. The body was weak, the spirit surrendered. But the heart, firm. He would not run, he would not turn back. He had chosen to obey, even without relief, even without comfort. And once again he returned to the disciples. And once again, they were sleeping. Jesus then stopped, looked at them. Maybe he smiled with tenderness. Maybe he just sighed, but there was a deep understanding. He knew he was walking a path that no one else could follow, not even the closest, not even the most loyal. He knelt once more, and his body trembled. The loneliness of the cross began there. The abandonment, the pain, the surrender. And then, in a moment of divine mercy, an angel appeared to strengthen him, not to deliver him, not to spare him, but to give him strength to go on. Heaven didn't remove the cup, but it offered company, even if for a brief moment. It was the beginning of the agony. And even so, Jesus remained. Because love, when it's true, endures everything, even Gethsemane. When the angel departed, Jesus was no longer bowed only by the weight of sorrow, but by the sealed commitment. His body still trembled, but his decision was made. There would be no escape, no shortcuts. The cup would be drunk to the end. He rose, took a deep breath, and walked again to the disciples. "Are you still sleeping and resting? Rise, the hour has come. The Son of Man is being delivered into the hands of sinners." It was the end of the prayer, and the beginning of the arrest. In the distance, torches approached, footsteps, murmurs, the metallic sound of swords. The night ceased to be just cold, to become threatening. Judas came at the front of the group, leading those whom Jesus himself had created. He came with a kiss, a symbol of affection, used as an instrument of betrayal. But that was the next scene. There, at that moment, Jesus was still alone with his own. There was still time for a final exchange of glances, still time for one last remembrance of all they had lived together. The garden became the altar, and the Lamb was ready. The humanity of Jesus was not an obstacle to his mission. It was the bridge that united God to man. He felt fear. He felt sorrow. He sweated blood. He asked for another way, but in the end, he chose to obey. He chose to love to the end. Gethsemane shows us that even the Savior of the world wept before the pain, that even he wished for another way, but above all, he remained, because true love never gives up, and salvation began with a knee on the ground. In the midst of shadows, the night was colder, but the light of redemption was already beginning to rise. The garden was now lit by flickering torches, rushed footsteps, hurried whispers, spears gleaming under the moonlight. The silent peace of Gethsemane had been broken, and with it, one of the most intense nights humanity has ever witnessed came to an end. But what remains after the tension, after the betrayal, the broken promise, the kiss that sealed the fate of an innocent man? What is left after the supper? The broken bread, the shared wine. What remains after the feet were washed, the eyes averted, and the disciples slept? Love remains. A love that doesn't depend on reciprocity, that isn't based on recognition, that doesn't demand immediate understanding. A love that gives even knowing it will be wounded. A love that prays alone, bleeds in the dark, embraces the bitter cup and says, "Thy will be done." This last part isn't about geography. It's not about the upper room or Gethsemane. It's about the heart of Jesus, and about the silent invitation he leaves for us. The love of Jesus that night was expressed in every detail. In the towel he tied around his waist. In the bread he broke with his hands. In the look he gave Judas even knowing of the betrayal. In the patience with Peter. In the tenderness with John, and in the silent prayer while everyone else slept. It is a love that does not impose, does not force, does not shout. It is a love that serves, that kneels, that listens, that weeps. This is the love that remains. When all other loves fail, those based on admiration, on interests, on convenience, this one remains. When friends run away, when promises go unfulfilled, when the world seems unjust, this love is still there, steady, unshakable, deep. Jesus knew that on that very night he would be betrayed, denied, abandoned, and even so he chose to love to the end. He knew Peter would deny him 3 times, and even so he washed his feet. He knew Judas would hand him over, and still he shared bread with him. He knew the disciples would flee, and even so he sang with them. The love Jesus demonstrated was not reactive, it was proactive. He didn't wait to be loved to love. He loved first, loved completely, loved unconditionally. This is the love that remains, and that love continues today. It's not confined to time, nor to that table, nor to the dark garden. The same love that washed the disciples' feet is the love that welcomes our tired steps. The same love that wept in silence is the one that holds us during difficult nights. The same love that didn't flee from the cup is the one that invites us to trust, even without understanding. How many times have we also denied? How many times have we promised faithfulness and under pressure stepped back? How many times have we slept while he asks, "Watch with me," and still, he remains. Patient, present, loving. The supper was not just a farewell, it was a milestone, a silent declaration of a love that goes to the end. When Jesus broke the bread, he was saying, "This is my body, for you." When he lifted the cup, he was sealing a new covenant. This is the blood of the new covenant. A covenant based not on strength, but on grace, not on perfection, but on surrender. As we reflect on that night, we must ask ourselves, what have we done with that love? Do we treat it as something common? Do we keep repeating the same empty promises, the same rushed gestures, without understanding the depth of that act? Have we merely watched this story, or allowed it to transform us? Jesus didn't expect perfection from the disciples. He knew their flaws, their limitations, their inconsistencies. Yet he still called them, still loved them, still forgave them, and that gives us hope, hope that even in our failures, he remains. Even when we run away, he continues. Even when we deny him, he looks at us with compassion, because his love is not conditional. It is not human. It is divine. The Last Supper was indeed a farewell gesture, but it was also a revelation of what truly matters: service, surrender, humility, silent faithfulness, forgiveness before the offense. That is the love that transforms. Not romantic love, nor love based on return. It is the love that gives, that endures, that remains. And now, the choice is ours. We can simply watch this story, or kneel before it. We can just remember, or be transformed. Because the love Jesus showed us that night is still here, waiting, calling, transforming, and remaining.